A surprised mother saw her 4-year-old son who was crying as he was tying his shoes. "Why are you crying?" she asked. "I have to tie my shoes," he sobbed. "But you've just learned how. Isn't it that hard? It's not that hard, is it?" And he wailed, "But I'm going to have to do it for the rest of my life." We know that feeling too, don't we, as we face this new year? For we have to face it with all of its demands, with all of its chores, for all of its days. And if we had our way, we would like to have a schedule that gets lighter as time goes by. And yet, traveling down the road of life, we know that that's not going to happen. Well, we told ourselves, right? When I graduate from school, things will get easier. When I get married, then all my problems will be gone. When the babies finally get out of diapers, then things will improve. When I'm financially secure, then the headaches and the worries will stop. And when I finally retire, then I can enjoy the golden years. And yet we soon learn that in every passage of life, we are met with different and newer challenges. Like the boy who was crying when he was tying his shoes and sobbing, well, with that everyday new challenge, well, we know that feeling, don't we? The routine and the schedules of life, they don't always get lighter. But we certainly need more light to illuminate our way and where to go. And this is where the story of the wise men can help us today, because it gives us some hints how we might go into the new year. First of all, we see that the wise men were willing to follow a greater light. They saw the star, and they made a commitment to follow it to the place where Jesus was born. The scriptures tell us they traveled from afar. We know the journey was long, that the journey was arduous. Obviously, it had to have a lot of planning in order to make a trek like that. And so by day and by night, they traveled. They traveled following the star. But even though their way was lighted, the road ahead of them was still treacherous. It was still dangerous. There was rough terrain that was in front of them, right? And then there were the road bandits that were lurking in the shadows. And of course, they must have known that there was King Herod who stood between them and their destination. But despite all those obstacles, they kept on their way to go, and they worshiped the Christ child. They presented gifts that they had brought. And that encounter changed their lives. Caroline, I like the way that you began your scripture today. And you talked about the epiphany and the light that comes. Well, that's what this day is about, to follow a greater light. Maxie Dunham tells a story about reading about who was an anthropologist who reported that within certain primitive tribes located deep in South American jungles, the most important role within that tribe is the keeper of the flame. Since fire is so precious and it takes such an effort to recreate, one member is entrusted with the responsibility of keeping the flame alive. During the night, the flame keeper adds wood to the fire. And he keeps the fire alive whenever the tribe moves to another location, carrying that fire in some type of vessel in order that that very difficult task of starting a fire under such a primitive conditions might not have to be repeated. His role, it is a vital task. And Max E. Dunham goes on to comment on this story about the anthropologist, and he says, the role is the most important in every tribe and in every culture. I have begun to believe that there must be keepers of the flame of truth, basic integrity, keepers of the flame of love, care for one another, keepers of the flame of conviction, willingness to stand up for what is right and what is just. As you and I enter this new year here at Mount Zion, God is calling us to be keepers of the flame. And a church is better able to serve God's purpose with fewer sparks of bickering and more light of encouragement. I mean, although the way before us will be hard, let us not harden our hearts. The church is a place where you and I, we keep the flame alive. We keep it going. And it's in the community of faith that we rely on each other to keep the fire going, to keep it from flickering out. So in this coming year, let you and I continue to follow that greater light. Secondly, we know that the wise men knew the importance of humility. Even with all of their knowledge about the stars, the wise men stopped in Jerusalem to ask questions to the rulers and religious leaders in the city about their destination. They didn't have a monopoly on the light. They were able to stop. They were able to ask for directions. We know it takes a humble person to know that he or she doesn't have all the answers, that he or she can't solve all the problems on their own. True humility stems from the knowledge that we are connected to each other and that each person has something to offer. You don't have to be honest. Even with a GPS device, I get lost. I had all kinds of GPS devices. I had one that every time I got lost, it said, recalculating, recalculating, recalculating. And maybe if Moses had the same thing, he wouldn't have got lost. Someone once said that the reason Moses and the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years is because men don't stop and ask for directions. I know all the women laugh, but that is a stereotype. We know that men ask for directions sometimes. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux once was asked to list the 4 cardinal virtues of life. And he answered, humility, 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 humility. Someone once said, you alone can do it, but you can't do it alone. Did you read the article in the Washington Post about the United Methodist Church? Raise your hand. I mean, we're a smart church, we know. We'll talk about it at our committee meeting for the way forward. We have a lot of bright people in this church, a lot of bright people all over the place. And we're going to need a lot of humility to talk about this issue. We're going to have to ask for a lot of light in dealing with this issue. I'd like to think that I have all the answers. Well, I just have a point of view. It doesn't mean I have answers for everyone. But we need to follow the Magi, the wise men, for this. For when they encountered the Christ child, they saw life differently. And they changed their direction in life. They were open to new insights. They were open to new ways of looking at things and doing things. They remind us that there are times when our own vision needs to be modified, when our own vision needs to be completely changed. When new information becomes available, then changes in direction are necessary. And sometimes those changes can be the difference between life and death. You know, the wise men, they knew about the stars. They relied on following the light, but they also had other sources to give them wisdom. Weren't they warned in a dream? Didn't they listen in a dream? Not to report to King Herod where the whereabouts of Joseph and Mary and Jesus were at. They went another way, scriptures tell us. And as trained scholars, they were not willing to let their own presuppositions be the limit of their knowledge. Rather, they listened. They listened to their dreams. And you know something? I think they even relied on their intuition. I mean, while they were in Jerusalem, they must have most likely kind of got a gist of the ulterior motives of King Herod in wanting to see and hear and go to the Christ child. And so maybe they heard stories about King Herod's paranoia, about his murderous ways. And open to new insights and new information, the scriptures tell us they traveled another road. You know, when you look at what's happening in our own church, you know, I'm not an expert, but there are people that are telling us that there are going to be different roads. I can't tell you what road to take. Really, it's a journey for all of us. But we'll have to really ask for light and illumination in this process. Barbara Brown Taylor was a professor of preaching, and in one of her books she tells us an experience that happened to her. And these are her words. She says, "My husband Edward is devoted to the hawks, especially to the golden eagles that are returning to Georgia. And driving down the highway with him can be a test of nerves as he peers out over the steering wheel and he's going back and forth and sometimes going off the road. My view is a little different," she says. "Keep your eyes on the road," I yell at him. "Who cares what it is? I'll buy you a bird book. I'll even buy you a bird. Just watch where you're going." And then a couple summers after that, she said they spent two months apart. And she said, I thought I'd get a break from hawks. But instead, I began to see them everywhere, looping through the air, spiraling up into the air, and hunkered down on treetops. And really seeing them for the first time in my life, I understood that I was not seeing them with my own eyes, but with Edward's eyes. He was not there. I was seeing them through him. He was present in me. Having visited the Christ child, the Magi traveled home in another way. They seen things different. And as we have experienced the birth of Christ and the birth of Christ in us, we will begin too to travel a different way. We begin to see things in new ways. We just don't see hungry people. Rather, we reach out and feed them and see them as people who are just like us. Isn't that right, Carol? We just don't live among our neighbors, but we seek to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. We don't just see others as competitors, but we acknowledge them as truly our brothers and our sisters' keepers. And we just don't classify people into good and to bad. But knowing that God sends rain to fall on the just and the unjust, Jesus comes to tell us that God's grace is extended to all. Only abundant grace can enable us to travel down the road of life in another way. I can learn a lot from the wise men. So I wish you a light schedule for this new year. Not a light schedule because life is easy, but a light schedule because life is hard and life is difficult. So go into this new year following God's light. And let God's light shine in you. Be keepers of the flame. Go into this new year with a sense of humility, knowing that we need each other. And we certainly need God. Go into this new year knowing that the directions that we traveled in the year before doesn't have to be the direction that we follow in this new year. Because we know with God's grace, God is making all things new. Amen.